Let's move on to question 2. Did our military action in Iraq increase the threat to Britain from Al-Qaeda? And who better to answer it than Baroness Eliza Manningham-Buller, Director General of MI5 between 2002 and 2007. Here she is, facing questions from Sir Rod Lyne at the Iraq Inquiry.
To what extent did the conflict in Iraq exacerbate the overall threat that your service and your fellow services were having to deal with from international terrorism?
Substantially.
Substantially. She then explained what the increase in the Al-Qaeda threat had meant for her departmental budget.
The fact is that the threat increased, was exacerbated by Iraq, and caused not only my service but many other services around the world to have a major increase in resources to deal with it. In 2003, having had an upgrade in resources after 9/11, which my predecessor agreed, and another small one in 2000, another one not small actually in 2002, by 2003, I found it necessary to ask the Prime Minister for a doubling of our budget. Now, this is unheard of, but he and the Treasury and the Chancellor accepted that because I was able to demonstrate the scale of the problem that we were confronted by.
That's worth repeating. The MI5 budget doubled as a result of the Iraq War. Baroness Manningham-Buller also revealed that Downing Street was told in advance that attacking Iraq would increase the threat to Britain from Al-Qaeda. That's not an argument against the war. The government can't let terrorist threats dictate its foreign policy, but Tony Blair did not pass on this risk assessment to Parliament. We now enter very deep waters. Our third question. Did Tony Blair enter into a secret agreement with George W. Bush that the UK would support US military action, come what may? To answer this, we need to know what passed between the American President and the British Prime Minister when they met 11 months before the outbreak of war. Tony Blair and family, even his mother-in-law came along, travelled to George Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas in April 2002.
Tony Blair and George Bush met on the Friday afternoon, on the Saturday, and Blair stayed with him, and for quite a significant period of time the President and the Prime Minister were alone.
Enter a new witness, Sir Christopher Mayer, British Ambassador to Washington from 1997 to 2003.
To this day, we are not sure what passed between them, but on the Sunday after this 24-hour summit at Crawford, Blair went off and made a great speech at the Presidential Library of George W.'s father at College Station.
If necessary, the action should be military. And again, if necessary and justified, it should involve regime change.
And that speech was the first public time that I know of when Blair supported regime change.
Leaving Iraq to develop weapons of mass destruction in flagrant breach of no less than 9 separate United Nations Security Council resolutions, refusing still to allow weapons inspectors back to do their work properly. That is not an option.
Now, is that the same thing as saying we're going to go to war and kick him out? It's not exactly the same thing, but it's another notch down the stick.
So did Tony Blair give the President his unqualified backing? Bear in mind, the importance of the College Station speech is disputed by Tony Blair's closest advisers. They say that the Prime Minister was talking about previous successful attempts at regime change in Sierra Leone and Kosovo, and no decision had been made about Iraq. Back to Sir Christopher Mayer.
I suspect he said something to Bush like, whatever you decide to do, George, you can count on me. The evidence for that is entirely circumstantial. It's partly the speech the following day, to which I've referred, and secondly, what I started to hear from the American administration in the weeks following the summit. The message you started to get back from the White House, from the State Department, from the Defense Department was, Great, you guys are on board for whatever we decide to do. Terrific.
So what you're saying is something quite interesting, actually, that you don't know what happened. Nobody knows what happened between Blair and Bush at Crawford because nobody was there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, immediately afterwards, Tony Blair mentions for the first time a regime change. And furthermore, the assumption thereafter from the United States is, yes, Britain is with us, come what may.
That's how it looked and sounded to me.
But we're not just depending on circumstantial evidence. There are two key documents written ahead of the meeting which suggest a fateful change in British policy. The first of these was written on the 14th of March 2002 by David Manning, Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister. Manning wrote to Tony Blair after a one-to-one meeting with Condoleezza Rice, the President's National Security Advisor in Washington.
I said that you would not budge in your support for regime change, but you had to manage a press, a parliament, and a public opinion that was very different than anything in the States. And you would not budge either on your insistence that, if we pursued regime change, it must be very carefully done and produce the right result.
The second memo was written 4 days later. I have in front of me, Sir Christopher, your memo to David Manning of 18 March 2002, saying, I opened by sticking very closely to the script which you used with Condi Rice last week.
Yeah.
What were your instructions?
Well, the great concern of the British government then was that the United States might go herring off to Iraq without a coalition. And so the question was, how do we persuade the United States to see that tactically, even strategically, it would be better to go to the United Nations because this is the best way of accumulating allies, and secondly, it pacifies domestic opinion, which may be very, very wary. So you start off by saying, sure, we support regime change. Saddam's a horrible man. His regime is disgusting, brutal, violent, and we want to see him go. So we're with you on that. And you could do it on your own. But wouldn't it be cleverer if, to reach the objective of regime change, if we were to do it in the company of others wrapped inside a Security Council resolution?
That's all very well, but that isn't what they were telling the British people. We were being told it was about weapons of mass destruction. Now, it's quite plausible to argue that the Mayor and Manning memos are consistent with Tony Blair's public commitment to disarming Iraq by force only if peaceful means don't work. We can't state beyond doubt, therefore, that Tony Blair signed a treaty in blood with George W. Bush at Crawford. At present, at least, the hard evidence just doesn't exist. And now for my fourth and final question. Was the war legal?
No.
Khan Ross, formerly Britain's expert on Iraq at the United Nations. Why not?
Because in my understanding of international law, the international law course that I did at the Foreign Office as I became a diplomat, war is legal under two circumstances, either in self-defense or it has to be authorized explicitly by the UN Security Council. And neither of those things was the case in the case of the 2003 invasion.
The UK and the US had managed to get one new Security Council resolution passed, the famous 1441, which told Saddam Hussein to prove that he no longer held weapons of mass destruction. But it was ambiguous. Most members of the Security Council did not consider that it gave explicit authority to use force against Iraq. Khan Ross again.
The UK attempted to introduce a resolution at the Security Council explicitly endorsing military action against Iraq, and it failed to get that resolution. And in my book, if you try to get the Security Council to give you authority to do something and it doesn't give you that authority, then you don't have authority. You can't then claim that, in fact, all the resolutions from 12 years ago, in fact, give you that authority. That's nonsense.
A brief history lesson. In 1990, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, an undoubted act of aggression. The UN Security Council then passed Resolution 678 authorising force to expel him. The British government declared that military action against Iraq in 2003 was legal, on the grounds that the authorisation in Resolution 678 had revived a full 12 years later. Admittedly, this took some Olympic standard legal gymnastics from the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith. Initially, he too had agreed with all 27 lawyers at the Foreign Office that military action without a second UN resolution was illegal. Documents released to Chilcot showed that Sir Michael Wood, the most senior lawyer at the Foreign Office, warned Foreign Secretary Jack Straw and his aides on numerous occasions that this was the case. What changed Lord Goldsmith's mind? We know from testimony to Chilcot that his change of heart followed meetings with politicians and their advisers in London, as well as US administration lawyers in Washington. Sir Stephen Wall, Tony Blair's adviser on European affairs.
I do recall a meeting at which Tony Blair asked Alistair Campbell and Sally Morgan, his political advisor, to go and talk to Peter Goldsmith, but I don't know any more than that.
You saw basically the Prime Minister order his two toughest political hench people to go off and have a word with the Attorney General.
Yes.
Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, as I say, I wasn't privy to the terms of reference of what they were asked to do, but it stuck in my mind because I remember thinking, they obviously weren't going off just to have a pleasant chat.
Goldsmith insists that he wasn't lent upon, telling Chilcot, "I reached the view that, on balance, the better view was that it was lawful." Indeed, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, told Sir John, "You are not able to bully the Attorney General." But, he continued, the Attorney General was bearing a very heavy burden of decision, absolutely. It's impossible not to have sympathy for the predicament of Lord Goldsmith. Elizabeth Wilmshurst, the Foreign Office lawyer who resigned because her own legal advice was ignored, told the Iraq inquiry this.
It seemed to have been left right until the end, the request to him for his formal opinion, as if it was simply an impediment that had to be got over before the policy could be implemented. For the attorney to have advised that the conflict would have been unlawful without a second resolution would have been very difficult at that stage without handing Saddam Hussein a massive public relations advantage.
Elizabeth Wilmshurst had waited 7 years to voice her views in public, and those attending the Iraq inquiry that day applauded her when she finally did so. And quite right too. But let's leave our final word with the Chief UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix. What's his verdict on Tony Blair's government?
If they had gone to the British Parliament in 2003 and said that, well, we have a lot of things that are unaccounted for here, and we suspect that there might be something, and we think it's safer to invade them, would the Parliament have dreamt of saying yes to such a thing? I don't think so. I think in order to go ahead, they needed to make the allegations which they made and which were not really sustainable.
That's devastating. And so basically you're telling me that Mr. Blair misrepresented the truth, lied indeed to the British Parliament in order to make the case for an illegal war.
Well, I'm a diplomat, so I'm not using such words, but in substance, yes, they misrepresented what we did, and they did so in order to get the authorization that they shouldn't have had.
So here is our answer. Yes, the British government did badly mislead Parliament about weapons of mass destruction. Yes, the war did very substantially increase the threat from Al-Qaeda. No, we have discovered no hard evidence that Tony Blair entered into a secret deal with the US president. And finally, yes, the war was illegal. Let's see if Sir John agrees.